Welcome to This Explainer. We spend so much of our lives obsessively planning for the future, right? Trying to secure it, trying to tie it up in a neat little bow. But today, we're going to take a step back. We're taking a quiet, reflective look at the actual structure of how we pass the world down. This is a concept drawn straight from reflective humanism. So let's just dive right in and look closely at the choices we're making today and exactly how they echo into tomorrow. To ground this, let's just look around us for a second. The roads we drive on, the cities we live in, our laws, borders, even our national debt, and the absolutely massive amounts of data we generate every single day. Think about it. Ancient Roman infrastructure stood for millennia, while modern concrete might degrade in just a few decades. But both leave a footprint for sure. Pretty much everything we interact with was created for us, right now, to solve our immediate needs. But here's the catch. They don't just disappear. They become the physical and cultural landscape inherited by future generations. And those generations, well, they can't exactly choose in advance whether or not they actually want them. And honestly, that realization leads us to a pretty fascinating question, one that kind of challenges a lot of our basic assumptions. Does responsibility toward future generations actually mean deciding the right future for them in advance? We usually just assume the answer is yes. We assume it's our absolute duty to build a perfect world and hand it over. But let's take a beat and really think about the mechanics of that assumption. Let's look at the actual flow of this kind of proxy decision-making. It goes in one direction. We start in the present. We try to imagine a future, and we estimate what we think the interests of those unborn people will be. Then, we make a concrete decision today. And finally, the future generation just receives the consequences. It's kind of wild when you map it out. While our intentions are incredibly good, what we're fundamentally doing is making a proxy decision. We're literally deciding on behalf of a generation that isn't even here to participate in the conversation. I mean, you hear it all the time in speeches and policies, right? For our children, for the next 100 years. These phrases absolutely reflect genuine, deep care for humanity's continuation. But the source text points out a gentle, yet really profound structural asymmetry here. Our care inherently contains an element of proxy control. We are setting their parameters. We're closing off some paths to gently, or maybe sometimes forcefully, guide them down the track we currently believe is best. So consider two very different ways of passing the baton. On one hand, you have a completed future. We lock in our values, our infrastructure becomes completely fixed, and future generations just have to adapt to our rules. On the other hand, we have a rechoosable future. In this scenario, decisions are provisional, changeability is preserved, and future generations actually have the space to reevaluate. Now, we aren't calling one entirely bad and the other entirely good. Civilization obviously needs long-term stability, for sure. But the really interesting observation here is that when underlying conditions change, the very things that create stability for us today might actually become a strict constraint for them tomorrow. So let's shift our perspective a bit. Instead of just asking, what do we leave behind? We really need to start asking, what paths do we close? And this brings the whole concept of planetary inheritance into focus. Civilizational inheritance isn't just about handing over assets, knowledge, and institutions. It's the whole shebang, including liabilities. Think about massive resource consumption or long-lived nuclear waste. But most crucially, it includes irreversibility. We are, in many ways, passing on the absolute inability to change certain things. Of course, not all decisions are created equal. They exist on this gradient of irreversibility. Some things are super easy to reverse. Some cost a lot of money or time. Some push us into a completely new state. And some things, like massive environmental shifts or deep infrastructural commitments, are almost entirely irreversible. Now, civilization absolutely must make decisions. We can't just be paralyzed. But as we move down this gradient toward the bottom, the deeper we go, the more we expand the scope of our proxy decision-making. We are making the call for them. So the crucial point here is how we actually define this. Reversibility is not time travel. It's not the ability to magically erase the past and pretend it didn't happen. As defined in reflective humanism, it's the condition where the past does not lock the future into only one trajectory. Reversibility is really all about preserving optionality. It is about leaving our descendants the room to stop, to reduce, to reassign roles, or to just boldly move to another path entirely when they realize our old solutions simply don't fit their world anymore. And if we overlay different scales of time, we see this beautiful structural resonance. Just think about how this works on a personal level. Your present self makes choices that bind your future self. On a societal level, the present generation binds the future generation. And on a planetary scale, the present civilization binds the future civilization. They literally all share the exact same temporal asymmetry. An earlier phase sends conditions forward, and the later phase can only respond after receiving them. The later phase can never send a message back. Just consider this phrase for a moment. Time has no reply function. It's a structural metaphor, but man, it carries a really deep weight. We are essentially sending messages in bottles into a future that can read them, but can never, ever write us back to ask us to reconsider. Because of that silence, we really have to recognize the difference between preservation and fixation. Passing decisions into the future shouldn't just be about handing over a finalized absolute conclusion. That is fixation, sealing the past as a strict rule. True preservation means the future can actually make contact with the idea again. It means keeping the lines of communication open so the past can be re-evaluated, not just blindly obeyed. So, how do we actually do that? Well, to allow the future to re-observe our choices, we can't just leave them the final rulebook. We have to preserve the context. We have to record what was decided, obviously, but also exactly why it was decided. We absolutely must admit what we didn't know at the time. Acknowledging our blind spots is so vital because it gives the future permission to update our logic when new information arrives. We also need to document the alternatives we considered, what we sacrificed to make our choice, and how provisional we actually thought the decision was. If we preserve this rich, somewhat vulnerable context, the future doesn't just inherit our rules. They inherit the exact scaffolding they need to safely dismantle, upgrade, or reinterpret them. And this brings us to a really fascinating application of this philosophy: artificial intelligence. As AI becomes the ultimate archive of our civilization's long-term memory, there's a real risk it could compress all our messy history into one single, finalized narrative, effectively locking in our current values forever. But according to reflective humanism, AI shouldn't just be an answer machine. Instead, it should act as an interference plane, a space that preserves our uncertainties, our contradictions, and even our discarded alternatives. By visualizing the paths we didn't take, AI can actually give future generations the breathing room to reinterpret history, rather than just having to accept it. We began this explainer by asking what responsibility actually looks like. So I want to leave you with this thought to quietly reflect on. Do we owe the future a perfectly completed world tied up with a neat little bow based on what we think is right today? Or do we owe them a world where they still have the space, the context, and the optionality to question our decisions? Thank you so much for exploring this with me today.